Hello and welcome to Gardening Basics with 4-HBC. This is our 7th lesson in series of short videos on beginner gardening topics that range from planting your garden all the way to harvesting your produce. My name is Hannah and I am the 4-H Canada's Youth Advisory Committee representative for BC. And it is my pleasure to introduce our gardening expert, Emma. Emma, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Hannah. Hi, everyone, and welcome back. So a little fun fact about me today is that so far this summer, I have been doing a lot of research for the Berry Council. And so I have been helping develop blueberry trials to help test and develop the new types of blueberries that we will be seeing on farms in the coming years.
We are looking forward to learning more today about gardening. What will we be covering, Emma?
So today we're going to be looking at something called integrated pest management. First, we'll talk a little bit about some very common garden pests that I'm sure many of you will have dealt with if you've been gardening at all. These are going to be your aphids and slugs and then cabbage moths. And then next we'll go into what integrated pest management is. So we'll talk about the differences between cultural, physical, biological, and chemical controls. So first up, we'll talk a little bit about some common garden pests. So in this first video, you'll get a good look at what an infestation of aphids looks like.
Hey everyone, so today we're talking a little bit about integrated pest management. So I'll get a little bit more into what integrated pest management is in a little bit. That'll be the next video. But right now I want to talk a bit about one of our common garden pests that you can find and that actually do a lot of damage, and these are aphids. So if you have a garden, you have probably come across these before. This is what it looks like when you have a fairly heavy infestation of aphids on, this is a kale leaf. So when you look at the upper side of the leaf, it looks pretty normal. And then you flip it over, and this is where we see a lot of these aphids. So in here, you can see some of their young, some of their adults. But one of the cool things that you actually see also, and I don't know if we'll be able to focus in on it, is that in here, there are actually parasitoids of a beneficial insect that has gone in and has laid their eggs inside of the aphid young. So this is kind of one of those cool examples of cause and effect, why you have beneficial insects or why you create a garden that is a good habitat for beneficial insects, because they will actually be going around in your garden and helping combat some of these pests as they come up. If you happen to have aphids in your garden, one of the best ways to get rid of them is to just spray it with a hose. But you can see here, so this is the plant that I actually plucked this leaf off of. If you look at it, it looks fairly healthy, but what these will do is that eventually, if you have a big enough of a problem with them, they'll suck out all of the sap from these leaves, and so you'll start seeing some kind of yellowing, drying, curling leaves. And if you look on the underside of some of these, you can see that there's the beginning of some of these infestations. So over on the bottom here, you can see it on the top leaf as well. So if you give this a good spray with a hose fairly regularly, it's a really easy way to take care of this.
So in that video, you got a pretty good look at what a fairly heavy infestation of aphids look like on a kale leaf. But it is important to note that not all aphids are the same. So you have a whole bunch of different species of aphids that target a huge variety of crops. Some are generalists, meaning that they'll go after a lot of different types of crops, but some are specific to certain plants. Aphids are small, they're sap-sucking insects, and they weaken your plant significantly. And one of the key things here is that they multiply very, very quickly. So they can have multiple bursts or multiple seasons inside a single season, and they come in many different colors, but they really carry the same characteristics. So if you're looking at for an aphid infestation on your plants, you'll see these curling, stunted, and yellowing leaves. And then to always make sure that you flip over your leaf and look at the back side of it, because they're usually, like in the video, hiding on the underside of your leaves or on the buds of your flowers. So when you're coming to ID or identify your aphids, they're going to be under a 1/4 inch. They're quite small. They're soft-bodied and pear-shaped with long antennae. They come in a variety of colors, and one of the key ways that is an easy way to identify them is that their nymphs, which are just their juveniles, look very similar to their adults. So next up, we're going to talk about something that I'm sure everyone has had an encounter with in their garden or in other people's gardens at some point. Slugs are one of the most common pests in the Pacific Northwest, although they're not actually an insect. Slugs are very voracious eaters, and they cause a huge amount of damage in gardens. They really do like cooler, wet weather, and they can go after your seedlings and decimate them and do some serious damage, even to mature plants, in just a single night. They're really good decomposers, and they help digest dead plant and animal material into usable form for your garden. So in reality, slugs are not a terrible thing for your garden, but when we have too many of them, or when they're focusing in on things like the seedlings that you just put out, they can become a really big problem. And they mostly feed at night. So it's one of those things where you will very rarely see the slugs doing the damage to your garden, but what you can always see is that they usually leave that telltale slime trail, and it basically gives you a pretty good trail of their destruction. So a good way to deal with slugs is to, and we'll talk about this a little bit further on, but you can actually go through your garden at night with a flashlight and pick them. It's kind of gross, but it works really, really well. And I'll talk a little bit more about some more control methods a little bit later on. So the last garden pest that we're going to talk about is the cabbage moth. So these ones are quite pretty. You've probably seen them flying around. They're those little white moths that you see. The cabbage moths are not the actual problem. It's their young that are. So the cabbage moth larvae are caterpillars, and they do a pretty significant amount of damage to crops that are in the brassica family. So those are things like cabbage, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, and cauliflower, just to name a few. And so why they're a big deal is that cabbage moths lay their eggs in the leaves of plants. And then when those caterpillars hatch, they feed really heavily for around 2 weeks before they pupate and turn into adults. The damage looks like large irregular holes chewed through your leaves, or a translucent layer of leaf left behind from what they have eaten. With cabbages, and this is where you will really see the damage done, the caterpillar will bore holes straight through the head and then contaminate them with fecal pellets. So when you go to harvest your head of cabbage, oftentimes you will have big tunnels bored all the way through of what would have been a really nice head of cabbage. Caterpillars are 1 to 1¼ inch long. They're velvety green with short fine hairs and faint yellow stripes down its back. And then the moths are pale white or pale yellow, and they have a 1 to 2 inch wingspan. So they're quite small. And then they usually have either 3 or 4 black spots on their wings. And so I will give you a little bit more information about how to deal or how to avoid having things like cabbage moths when we talk about integrated pest management in the next couple slides. So next up is a video that will just kind of give the basics of what integrated pest management is.
So when we're talking about integrated pest management, we're basically talking about a toolkit that growers use to be able to control things like insect pests, weeds, and other types of diseases in their gardens. So integrated pest management comprises of physical, cultural, biological, and chemical controls. And these are all different methods that a grower will go through in order to try to make sure that they can keep their pest populations to a manageable level. So the first one that we're going to talk about is cultural control. This basically is just making sure that your growing environment is the best that it can be so that you have the least amount of pest pressure and the highest amount of beneficial insects, or those ones that are going to do a lot of things for your garden. The next step that we can talk about would be physical control, and this is when we actually use physical things like traps or row covers or pheromone traps, all of these very physical barriers that will actually help keep out or control some of our pests. The third one is biological. So this is when we actually introduce beneficial insects like say ladybugs or lacewings, any of these predatory insects that are going to help control some of the pests that are in our garden. And then the last one is chemical. And so I know that everybody has either some opinion on chemical control, but when we talk about integrated pest management, it should be used as your last resort. So when we look at chemical control, it's what we use when we've kind of run through all of our other options, and is a way of kind of managing a population or a pest problem that has gotten to a point where none of our other methods are going to end up working. So this is pretty much what IPM, or integrated pest management, stands for, and it's just a toolkit that growers use in order to properly manage their gardens.
So integrated pest management, if we're looking at cultural control a little bit closer, in essence, cultural control is manipulating your growing environment for having the most favorable growing conditions and conditions that are unfavorable to pests. So one of the big things to think about here is that cultural control methods are preventative, not curative. So that means that they will prevent having a big pest problem, but they're not going to control it or cure it once that problem has gotten to a point where it's a big deal. Cultural control can be thought of as a combination of a few different things. So these would be things like site design, site maintenance, and then harvesting procedures. So when I say site design, I mean how closely you put your plants together or what plants you put beside each other. So we talked a little bit about companion planting in some of our previous videos. And then site maintenance. So this is things like making sure that you weed often, or that you take off dead or just decaying leaves that might attract some of these pests into your garden. And then harvesting procedures. So this would be something along the lines of, if you happen to see a pest population, you can actually harvest before you would, and that can help deal with that population fairly quickly. So all aspects of cultural control are done with your common pests in mind to reduce the attractiveness of your garden and crops. It's not designed to be used, like I said, when you already have a bad pest problem, but it's more just a kind of really good practices that you want to use in your garden to make sure that you have the best environment that you can possibly have. So next up, we're talking about physical control. And this, like I mentioned in that video, is just the physical methods of controlling your pests. So things like traps or row covers or pheromone stations are any physical means of trapping or deterring pests. Some products are ineffective, so you want to make sure that you look for ones that come with good reviews or come from a really reputable source. But physical control methods are a really great way to help keep pest populations at a manageable level. So physical control usually have little impact on non-target tests. And I really want to talk about some of those common garden pests in this particular slide, because this is where you can actually have some pretty good control over your slugs. So one of the main things that folks use to do in their gardens to help keep their slugs under control is that you can actually get slug bait traps, and they do work fairly well. And then another example of physical control, which is for helping to control cabbage moths, are actually these things called row covers, and you can put them on in the springtime, and they are a semi-permeable row cover that allows sunlight and moisture through, but they will stop your cabbage moths from coming in and laying their eggs on your leaves. So those are two really good examples of how physical control methods can help deal with some of our most common garden pests. Next up is what we call biological control, and this is when we're using beneficial insects to control our insect pests. So these use the natural enemies of pests to suppress or control pest populations. Many of our garden pests have natural enemies that will reduce your pest numbers by eating or parasitizing. So like you saw in that first video where there was actually parasitized eggs of those aphids on that leaf, that was from a parasitic wasp that lives in your garden naturally and was actually helping you control that pest population. So you need to consider your setting when you're using biological controls. Releasing insects could have a negative impact on our ecosystem, or, and kind of more importantly, is that they actually may not stay where you release them. So if you can imagine releasing something like ladybugs into your garden, they'll only stay there for as long as there is food there for them to eat. Biological control is another one that's not really designed to be used when you already have a bad pest problem, but they will definitely help you control pest populations before they become a major issue. So lastly, we're going to talk about chemical control. So IPM likes to use chemical control as kind of a last resort, but there's a lot of ways that it can be done very effectively and with the environment in mind. When we think about chemical control, we like to think of it as the last tool in your toolkit. There's a lot of different types of chemical controls that can be used, and these can be both organic or synthetic. If using chemical control is necessary, use a product that's selective if you can, so that it only targets your pest problem. This can be really good for helping reduce harm to beneficial or non-target insects. Most importantly is to read the label. Make sure that you're using the right product and that you're aware of all of the safety and environmental precautions needed. Chemical control should only be done by an adult. So if you're ever unsure or are looking for a little bit more advice on whether or not a certain product is the right one for you, You can go to somewhere like an agricultural extension office and ask them what the best products are to be using. Something that we can look at a little bit further is how to go through and decide which of the products that you want to be using. But it is really important to make sure that when you're doing chemical control, it's done by an adult and that you've read the label thoroughly to make sure that you're using the product that's going to be right for your situation.
Thanks, Emma. I really enjoyed learning about these common garden pests. I have seen aphids and cabbage moths and the damage they can do, so it was interesting learning more about them. Also, I do have a question. What's the best way to find or see thrips and a way to deter them?
So that's a great question, Hannah. Thrips are kind of an easy one to misidentify just because they're really difficult to see. So it's very hard to see thrips with the naked eye. Usually you have to actually use a hand lens in order to be able to see them properly. But one of the easiest ways that you can tell that a thrip has been, or thrips that have been feeding on your plants, is that they'll actually go through and they will kind of suck a lot of that chlorophyll out of your plant, and they'll leave a really white, papery kind of left behind. And then the easiest way to see is that while they're feeding, they actually leave little fecal deposits on your leaves. So you'll get these kind of like white paperish colored leaves that have little black dots all over them. So when you're looking at that, they can do pretty significant damage to your plants just because they take away your plant's ability to photosynthesize through their chlorophyll. When it comes to deterring thrips, one of the easiest ways is just when we talk about kind of going back to cultural control, but this is just something as easy as removing the leaves as soon as you see them. So because thrips are so small, if you're looking at damaged leaves, then they're often not going to be very far. So taking away those damaged leaves as quickly as you can is a really good way to kind of help prevent them. There are other things like excluding, if you're growing inside of a greenhouse, trying to exclude those thrips from getting into the greenhouse. There are a lot of biological control or beneficial insects that we can use, but definitely one of your easiest things to do if you're gardening outside and you see thrips is just to make sure that you have all of that vegetation that's damaged taken out of there as soon as you can.
Thanks, Emma, for sharing all this great information on pest management. Can you tell us what we will be covering in the next lesson?
Absolutely. So next lesson, we're going to look at integrated pest management a little bit more, but this time we're going to be focusing in on weeds. So instead of doing insect pests, we'll be looking at different types of weeds and all of the various different control methods to help us deal with them in our garden. Thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you next time.